Happy to be with you all today to talk a bit about um, preventing behavior, preventative approaches to challenging behavior in the classroom. And this is a nice follow from 2 weeks ago, if you were with us, when Katie presented on systems for preventing problem behavior at the school level, so the school-wide systems to preventing problem behavior, and really outlining that PBIS as positive behavior interventions and supports. And so this is a nice carryover to that, because really what we are going to do is take all of those foundational practices and systems that are present and we know that are helpful to support all students at the school level, and talk about really how then we can bring them into the classroom, and as educators and those supporting educators to use those practices in the classroom to support students. This is just an outline of the different topics that we have throughout the year through this panel. So excited to be on session 2 with you. So 2 weeks ago, Katie talked about, again, those school-wide systems, and that goal of the school-wide implementation of positive behavior interventions and supports is to really help to shape an environment and a school climate that helps to create an environment that's more predictable, positive, consistent, and safe. Really looking to create those effective and equitable learning environments for all students. So at the classroom level, again, we want to take that same concept and idea and make sure that we are equipped as educators, and we're equipping our educators to know how to bring those practices into the classroom, because it's great to have those things available and present school-wide, but if they're not built into the classroom, then we're still going to fall short, because the classroom is where students are really spending the majority of their time. Before we jump into classroom, though, I want to take just a quick minute or two just to outline really why behavior happens. And we've talked about, if you were with us last year, functions of behavior, and Katie talked about a bit 2 weeks ago, when behavior occurs, it can either be a can't do or a won't do. But regardless, kind of the same kind of sequence applies. So something happens in the environment that triggers a need in the student. And at the foundational level, it's to get something or to get out of something. And then we act on that need. And this applies not just to our students, but to us as adults as well. And then we act on that need and engage in behavior with the intention of meeting that need, to either get something or get out of something. And if that behavior works for us and that need is met, then we're more likely to engage in that behavior in the future. This can apply to pro-social appropriate behavior, but it can also apply to problematic behavior. And so usually we talk about this specifically when students are engaging in behavior that's become a problem or disruptive to the environment. And so ideally what we want to do is stop that problematic behavior from paying off, right? We don't want that behavior to meet the need, but how do we stop that behavior? And it's not just as easy as applying a consequence and thinking that that's going to make the problem go away, because we know historically that that's not sufficient. That really, in order to prevent behavior from occurring and to stop students from engaging in problem behavior, we also need to think about what skills they need, but also how do we prevent it in the first place? Because many times when students are engaging in problematic behavior, the question is often, how do I make it stop? But really, ideally, we want to think, more proactively than that. And how do I prevent it from occurring in the first place? So in order to then respond or prevent problem behavior from occurring, we need to think about how can we adjust the environment? How can we proactively set the student up for success and meet their needs ahead of time? That problem behavior is occurring with a purpose to meet a need. So what type of replacement behavior can we teach them to engage in instead? Because we can't just stop the problem behavior and not replace it with something, because at the foundational level, there's still a need. So there's still a need that needs to be met. And if we don't give them a more appropriate way to meet that need, and we try to just punish the problem behavior, they're likely to come up with another way to meet the need that's probably just as problematic as the first one. So we need to teach that replacement behavior. We also need to think about kind of going back to, is it a can't do or a won't do, and what skills need to be taught, whether it's coping skills, social emotional skills, maybe there's a need for other academic skills if they're engaging in the behavior to escape a task because it's difficult and they don't have the skills they need to engage in that activity. But really thinking about what other skills need to be taught as well. And then that behavior continues because it's valued by the environment. So when we're thinking about how to prevent behavior in the classroom, we want to really help both ourselves and other teachers to understand why behavior is occurring in the first place. So foundationally, we need all three of these components. We need to think about how we're preventing behavior from occurring, what we're teaching, what skills we're building, what we're teaching the student to do instead, and thinking about how we can respond differently, both to minimize the problem behavior from paying out, but also to strengthen the new skills that we're teaching so that those become what are more valued, what gets the student good things, what gets the student the attention. So we can break that down a little bit further. So we think about preventing. What can we do to consider and address environmental factors, and thinking about things like predictability, ensuring they have the supports and accommodations they need to access instruction, and also how are we thinking about and adjusting motivation so that they're motivated to engage in the things that we're asking them to do. Ensuring that they have access to effective instruction. Again, what skills need to be taught? How are we teaching and making sure they can access that instruction? And then how are we responding? Again, both to acknowledge, so we're acknowledging and reinforcing and trying to strengthen those new skills that we're teaching. What are we doing to prompt or reteach when behavioral mistakes occur? And how are we responding to correct if problem behavior occurs? So it's kind of a global approach. But when we look at, again, we're bringing those PBIS practices and foundations into the classroom, we're going to go through 5 effective classroom practices. So organizing the physical environment, creating a positive atmosphere, thinking about how we're establishing expectations and routines, engaging students in learning, and responding effectively to behavior. And these are all the same foundational practices that Katie talked about 2 weeks ago at the school-wide level. And now we're just bringing them down to the classroom level and making sure that we have all of those things consistently embedded in all locations within our building. So in organizing the physical environment, this can be a really important one, right? Thinking about ensuring that the classroom and the environment is set up in a way that makes learning as easy and positive and engaging as possible for all of our learners. Thinking about how seating arrangements are set up so that students can always see the different places where instruction's provided within the classroom. Making sure that all of the spaces in the room are clearly organized, that students can easily access the materials that they need. And then having things posted in the classroom that make it inviting and engaging without being overwhelming. I know I had a discussion with my younger daughter this year going into fourth grade, and someone asked her what teacher she wanted. And although she had positive experiences with both teachers, she made her selection and stated that she didn't want the other because they have so much stuff in the classroom. She knew it would be difficult for her to pay attention and that she would be distracted because she does get a little distracted by her environment. So just being aware of wanting enough things so that it's engaging and it's a warm place to be without being too much. Working to build a positive atmosphere. Katie talked about it and multiple others have talked about it in various presentations in this series last year as well. Just the need for building positive relationships, students feeling connected to at least one individual within the building, And so really thinking about how are you and how are our teachers really creating a positive atmosphere where students want to be in the classroom, where it feels like a safe, positive, supportive, encouraging place to be. And so some ways to do that are really thinking about how are we building relationships? How are we really intentionally building that positive atmosphere? Because we really can't just hope that it happens. We really have to be intentional about setting this up, setting up activities to build connections, to really establish community in the classroom, getting to know students. One of the simple ones that simple examples that gets mentioned often is just greetings at the door, right? This is a great way to have that one-on-one interaction quickly, but have a one-on-one positive interaction with the student as they're coming in the morning. It can also be a great way to kind of assess how each student is doing that day, right? And if a student comes in and maybe their head's down or they're not as bubbly or responsive to your greeting, maybe you know then to go check in one-on-one with that student a little bit later in the morning as you have opportunity. But really thinking about how are we, or how are you, and as educators, how are we taking time to really build this community and positive relationships and sense of belonging within the classroom. Oftentimes, when we talk about PBIS and classroom management, sometimes folks will say, well, we don't have time for that. But we also don't have time not to. Because if we don't really spend the time on the front end, really proactively setting up the environment, taking time to really establish solid classroom management practices. And yes, it takes time, and yes, it takes effort, but the result is much more positive. Your lessons flow smoothly. You have a plan for how you're acknowledging and responding to students and to behaviors as they occur, and things roll a lot more smoothly, and you spend a lot less time reactively responding to behavior. Then if we don't spend the time up front, you're going to spend a lot more on the back end reacting and responding to problem behavior. And that tends to feel a lot more difficult. And that type of time is that time that starts to make us feel like we don't want to go to work in the morning, right? And so putting forth that time on the front end really has positive impacts, not just for us and enjoying our job and enjoying our day with our students, but also for our students and making the environment positive and supportive and safe for all involved. Establishing expectations and routines. This is a really big one. And so if at the school-wide level, your school has school-wide values, that's fantastic, because then you can take those values and bring them into your classroom and then be able to outline and identify then what does that look like in your classroom? What are your classroom expectations that align with those school-wide values? Because if you have those school-wide values, you've already got a solid foundation. Great. Now, what does it look like to be respectful in my classroom? What does it look like to be responsible in our classroom? What does it look like to be safe? And not only can you identify those for the classroom as a whole, but you can also then break those down even further to what those look like during specific routines or times of day or activities in your classroom. Just like our school-wide values and expectations, they should be positively stated, student-friendly, right? So our students know what it is that we're talking about when we say respectful or responsible or whatever your values are. And we have to explicitly teach them. And they should be posted so our students can reference those and post it in a way that our students can access. So in early elementary, maybe it's text paired with a visual. Up into upper elementary, secondary, obviously they can be just more text, but they should be posted so that even after we've taught them, they're there as that visual reminder for students to reference and for us to also reference to prompt and redirect as needed. But they have to be explicitly taught. We can't just post them on the wall and say, see, they're there. We have to explicitly teach them and pre-correct for them often, right? I was in a classroom recently, and this is one of the things that came up, that things were explicitly taught at the beginning of the year, but students need to hear those things often every day, or even more often than that. That if we have younger learners, or maybe a population of students where they're going home to very different expectations at home, right? We're having to, every day they come back, we're kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We might need to be really outlining those expectations every time before we jump into the next activity. Okay, we're going to have some class discussion. This is what it's going to look like to be respectful and responsible and safe during our discussion. So that really becomes common language, and they're hearing that positive language of what we're expecting all the time, right? But then that becomes, will help to establish those and support those behaviors to becoming more fluent and more of the go-to that they're engaging in your classroom. Thinking about your classroom routines, right? If you have any times in your day where you can kind of reflect and say, "Ooh, this time of the day is just really hectic," maybe we need to build in a routine or a procedure for that. Maybe it's Chromebooks. I had a colleague that shared that one year was the first year that they got Chromebooks, and they got them a couple weeks into the school year, and she had the cart and the Chromebooks, and it only took a day or so for that Chromebook return to be a disaster, and nothing was charged and nothing was plugged in, to realize that, oh, I need to really establish a routine and teach and practice this with my students. And those help your classroom to run more smoothly. It helps to decrease transition time. And it helps to create that consistency and predictability in your environment. But thinking about, do you have procedures for how we enter the classroom, how homework's turned in, how we transition to a new activity, making sure students know how to get help or access extra supplies, request a bathroom break. All things that in and of themselves maybe don't take a ton of time, but if you are fielding 5 or 6 students every activity kind of raising their hand to ask if they can go to the bathroom, maybe we need to establish a signal or a system, right? Things that help to decrease the disruption to your instruction. And so you can create a classroom matrix. So just like with school-wide PBIS, we have a school-wide matrix where you have your school-wide values and the different locations in the building. This brings it into the classroom and breaks it down specific to your classroom routines. So, and again, if you already have school-wide values, that's great. Those are already set. And then all you have to do is outline what are kind of the big routines or procedure things that I want to outline for my classroom. And then what do those specific expectations for each value look like in my classroom? And I like this example because then we also have this when I feel upset column at the end, right? And again, what does it look like to be respectful even when I'm upset? What does it look like to be organized and achieving even when I'm upset, responsible, etc. And so this is a nice way to bring that into your classroom. And you can either pre-establish this and introduce and teach it to your class, or teachers have also provided an opportunity for students to have input in developing this. Okay, what does respectful look like during morning meeting? What do you think responsible looks like when we're online using the computer? And then they have some voice and choice and participation in determining what those specific expectations are for those times in their classroom. So really, again, taking the time to develop those routines and expectations is really important. And that's one of those things that we really we don't have time not to do because it's that important to how your classroom flows. The next is engaging students in learning. Really thinking about, students just sitting and taking in information isn't going to be really effective in that if they're not actively engaged, they have more time to engage in other problematic behavior or to be off task. And so if we can engage them in instruction, so maybe they have whiteboards, and so they're holding them up and responding to questions intermittently, or they have response cards, or there's some other ways that they can participate and engage in instruction. Those all help them to be more involved and more engaged, and thus less likely to engage in problem behavior because they're actively engaged in your lesson. and really thinking about, how can I embed that in all of the different instructional times of the day, so that students are really engaged in learning. There's a variety of different opportunities to respond, and these are just some examples. Just 3 categories highlighted here. So action, verbal, or written, and then some examples of what that might look, those different types of interactions and opportunities might look like. And different ones fit better to different types of subjects or activities. But so there's a variety of options and things to include. And then the last is thinking about, how am I going to respond to behavior? So both being prepared to acknowledge and reinforce those appropriate behaviors that you're wanting to see in the classroom and that you're teaching with your routines, but also how are you going to respond to prompt or redirect students to be on task? And how do we respond when problem behavior happens? Because being prepared and having a plan for how we respond when those things happen allow us to respond in a way that's quick and calm and quickly addresses the issue and allows us to move on, versus if we're not prepared, or sometimes when we get caught off guard, we're a little bit more likely to react and inadvertently in ways that could escalate the situation. And so trying to be prepared for as many situations as possible and having a general plan for how to respond. One way to help increase your ability to respond, again, both to reinforce, prompt, and correct, is active supervision. Really thinking about that standing in front of the classroom and providing instruction, you can only see so much from the front of the room. And even if you have your seating in such a way where you can see most of your students, there's still things that get missed. Or students still might feel like they can kind of hide or be under the radar and maybe doing some other things under their desk. Whereas if you're rotating continuously throughout the classroom as much as possible, this provides you an opportunity to really see all parts of the classroom, kind of have a sense of how students are doing, whether you're providing whole group instruction or they're working individually, but you can help to monitor what their engagement and participation and on task look like. You can then acknowledge, prompt, and redirect or correct as needed, because you're really circulating continuously. Thinking about how you're going to acknowledge appropriate behavior. And so if your school is implementing PBIS, they will likely have some type of school-wide acknowledgement system. And you can oftentimes build and use that in your classroom, but maybe you also want to think about what other layers of acknowledgement and reinforcement you want to establish and have in place. Maybe it's group points or beat the teacher game, and they earn whatever if they beat the teacher for the day, or if they earn enough points for being on task or engaging in appropriate behavior. But thinking about what types of systems you have in place to acknowledge student behavior throughout the day. Because we really need to, again, systematically and explicitly think about how we're reinforcing and acknowledging students for engaging in those behaviors we want to see. Because the more we acknowledge those things we want to see, we'll see more of them. And then also having a consistent response to inappropriate or problematic behavior. Really thinking about, what that looks like, different consequences for different types of behavior in your classroom, so that it's not student dependent, or it's not kind of dependent on the day, but really dependent on the system where you have some things pre-established, and that's how you're responding to behavior. A couple resources for you here. This is an example of a hierarchy or a continuum of response to redirect and address students that might be engaging in off-task or disruptive or problematic behavior in the classroom. Ways that go from strategies that are as less disruptive to your instruction as possible, and things that obviously take more time, or you may have to pull the student aside. And not that you have to kind of check off each one as you go, but kind of thinking about what strategies work best for you and for your students. And this QR code will take you to a printable visual of these. Some other things to think about when you do have situations where students are beginning to engage in problem behavior. really then thinking about what other tools do you have in your toolbox, and what other strategies can we start to try and implement in order to try and support that student to prevent that behavior from continuing to occur. Again, thinking about how can we prompt them to get their need met in a different way. And so this is a resource that outlines, these are just a variety of different universal strategies that are helpful and good practice that could be beneficial for all students. So you could try these at the first signs of some disruptive or problematic behavior. As behavior starts to increase and we maybe start to think about why the behavior is happening, so kind of going beyond the to get something or get out of something, but really thinking more functionally about, you know, why, what is the function behind the behavior. There's a variety of strategies specific to what can we do to adjust the environment, how can we make the environment more predictable, how can we adjust motivation, ensure appropriate instruction, and proactively meet the student's needs. And there's a list of these for each of the 4 functions of behavior. And again, this QR code that's in the slides will take you to this resource. And then lastly, all the things we talked about today, again, we talked about the fact that we can't just hope they happen. We really have to plan for how we're going to do that and what that looks like in our classroom. And so there is a template for how to develop a classroom plan. There's a self-reflection of creating an effective classroom environment that you could use and kind of walk through, and then think about how you might be able to improve your practices in each of those areas. And then a template to help to outline and design your classroom management plan. And this link or QR code will take you there as well. And then links to some other resources that might be helpful. Thanks.